Hey everybody, I'm going to give you an overview of how you can set up the Help Desk Server product on Hyper-V Server 2019. This is an example of how you can set up the Help Desk Server on a few different products, a few different virtualization hosting kinds of products, or on physical hardware. So just briefly, you have a few different options in that same vein. So you can set up the Help Desk Server on Hyper-V Server 2019, on Windows 10 running Hyper-V, on VMware ESXi or vSphere, or on any Ubuntu server, whether a virtual machine or running on a physical host. The Help Desk Server can be run or installed on all of those platforms. The fourth of those that I just referred to, the Linux server, Ubuntu server running on your own virtualization hardware, kind of opens it up to running the Help Desk Server really anywhere. Could be on any piece of hardware or on any cloud service provider. So again, the focus for today is on running Hyper-V Server 2019 and installing the Help Desk Server into Hyper-V Server 2019. So some of the advantages, some of the reasoning why we're providing this information specifically kind of targeting Hyper-V Server 2019 is we have a lot of folks that are running the legacy Spiceworks desktop application or Spiceworks 7.5. There's a few different names for it. The inventory and help desk product that we created a little over 10 years ago. So as we look at most people that are using that application are obviously running it on physical hardware or virtualized it, but it's got to be run on top of Windows. So that means that for some of you, and especially as we've done some research over the last year, you've got a focus on Microsoft technology, and that's what you're familiar with, it's what you're accustomed to using, it's what you're accustomed to administering, that sort of thing. For some subset of those folks that may be using the Spiceworks desktop application and running it on Microsoft tech, we want to make that transition over to either using the Help Desk Server or the Cloud Help Desk product as a replacement. I want to make that transition as easy as possible for you guys. And so you may just say, look, I don't need the extra information on how to set up Hyper-V. I'm just going to set up my own Ubuntu server and install it. That's great. That's fine. That would be an easy way to do it if you're familiar with how to set up Ubuntu server and how to do Linux administration tasks, like basic Linux administration tasks, that sort of thing. If you're less familiar, if you're more of a Microsoft shop, you're more focused on Microsoft technologies and more experienced with that sort of thing, it's totally fine to get it, and we heard you in some of these surveys that, like I said, we've done over the course of the past year, and so we want to provide an option for you. So this is going to be a walkthrough of kind of what different technologies are used and how you can most easily get those things set up so that you can start running and testing your own Help Desk server. So without any further delay, let's take a look at how that works. Okay, great. So yeah, let's take a look at Hyper-V Server 2019, how you can use that to run a virtual machine, an Ubuntu server virtual machine, hosting the Help Desk server, what the steps look like to get that initial setup done so that you're running Help Desk server and can access it normally through a browser just like you would access either the Cloud Help Desk or access Help Desk server running on any other technology. So first let's start out with what is Hyper-V server. So there's a couple of versions of Hyper-V server available, Hyper-V server 2019 and Hyper-V server 2016. These are based on Windows Core, which is a kind of a server technology that's effectively kind of a stripped down version of Windows Server. So you can have a free version of specific roles or specific functionality of Windows Server. So Hyper-V Server allows you to run the Hyper-V specific roles of Windows Server without paying for a Windows Server license that enables you to run multiple different technologies. So the result is, in this case, in our example, I've got a piece of hardware. I've installed Windows Server 2019 onto that piece of hardware, done some initial setup via PowerShell, installed a web-based administration console that Microsoft provides called Windows Admin Center. And then once I've got Windows Admin Center installed, I've then got the ability to use a browser to access and administer that virtual machine. So let's take a look at quickly how you get that initial setup done on the host side, on the Hyper-V server side. So, I went through the same process as typically would do for setting up a new physical piece of hardware. I had a USB stick, installed Hyper-V server onto this piece of hardware, Went through the basic install steps, pretty standard stuff. And then once you've finished all that process, there's sconfig, which is available here. It allows you to do some basic administration tasks like adding an administration user, setting up network settings, that sort of thing. So I got this Windows Microsoft server up and running. I have an admin user set up that I am familiar with the credentials for, and I've got the network settings set up such that it's able to connect to the network that device is physically connected to. So great. That's all set up and done. Once I've done that, I've got a PowerShell prompt as well that I can use to finish up some of the rest of the setup. So one of the important things I want to do is I want to allow any virtual machines that I run on this Hyper-V server to access my local network as if they were just another physical device. And that's important because I want later all of my administrators and techs of the help desk server, I need them to be able to access the virtual machine using a web browser. So specifically, I want to be able to provide them with, like, here's the IP address of the server that you need to connect to, or I would go into DNS and set up a DNS record that would automatically alias that IP address for me so that they could use something like helpdeskdomain.com in a browser to access help desk server. That's typical setup for that. So it's important to get that set up. So let's look at what that looks like. So I would run get.net adapter. That's going to give me a list of the interface names that are available on this host. And once I've run that, I'm going to run this PowerShell command, new VM switch. I'm going to call it an external switch. I'm going to use that net adapter name I got from get.net adapter. And that's going to allow that virtual machine that I'm eventually going to set up here to access the local network like I was just describing, as long as I assign that external switch as the switch that the virtual machine uses. So if you're not familiar with how that works, let's just take a quick look. It's pretty simple. So I've got that virtual machine, virtual switch set up. So then once I've done that, I'm going to use this command here, do VM, to create a new virtual machine. That's going to be my help desk server virtual machine. It's going to be running the help desk server hardware within Ubuntu server. So what is all the parameters here for this new VM? So I've got an arbitrary name. I just chose binb-pc-vhd. That's going to be the name of the virtual machine. I've said it's going to have 4 gigs of memory. I'm using a VHD path, which is the VHD file which contains the Ubuntu server with help desk server pre-installed into it. That may or may not be something that we choose to release to you guys. This is just a little bit of a preview. So if we don't have a VHD available, what you would do is instead you'd create a new VM just like you would here. You would install Ubuntu server into that VM, and then you'd install help desk server, and we've got a script that allows you to easily install help desk server into any Ubuntu server. So now you're going to have a VHD-based virtual machine that's running Ubuntu server and help desk server installed into your Hyper-V server here. The last 2 things, generation 1, this VHD requires that the virtual machine created in Hyper-V be configured for Gen 1, which there's just Gen 1 and Gen 2 available in Hyper-V. And then, like I was just describing before, the switch name is going to be external switch. Again, that's going to allow this virtual machine to be accessed on the local network. Okay, so now I've gone through this process of creating this VM. The last step is I just want to start the VM. So up to this point, what I've effectively done is I've set up Hyper-V server, and I've configured Hyper-V server to allow virtual machines to connect to the local network, and then I've set up a virtual machine on that virtual switch so that my new virtual machine, which is now running, is going to have access to the local network. Great. Okay, so now what, right? So how do I get access to this virtual machine? How do I access the console, which allows me to interact with my Ubuntu server and start up that help desk server application? So that's where those the commands just above that here, invoke web request and then the MSI installation come in handy. So you're going to download the Windows Admin Center MSI package from Microsoft. Again, it's a free addition to the Hyper-V server. And once you've downloaded that, you'd run / and then the name of the MSI file, and you'll see a GUI installer come up. You run through that installation process, and you're now going to have a web browser-based administration console that you can use to administer Hyper-V server. So we get away from PowerShell, we get away from command line-based things in order to access and administer your new virtual machine. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like. So let's leave behind our console for the Hyper-V server and switch over to a browser. So that's what you're looking at here. This is, again, what we just installed, Hyper-V's Windows Admin Center service. And so you'll access that at the same IP address of the Hyper-V server. In this case, mine was 192.168.1.254. That's what we were RDP'd into just a second ago in order to access the console or the command line for that Hyper-V server. And this is just, again, a web-based administration view of that same server. So now we're looking at that Hyper-V Server 2019 installation. If I back up here a little bit, go back to kind of the home page for this Windows Admin Center, this is that Hyper-V Server 2019 that we just set up and installed and added Windows Admin Center to. So we go connect to that server. Just with a click, yeah, you'll see an overview of the information about that server, its current status and specs and so forth, and then you've got a list of different administrative tasks available on the left here, and you'll see at the bottom virtual machines and virtual switches. If I go first to that virtual switch listing, we should see my external switch pop up here. So I created this from PowerShell prompt. You could do this from this virtual switches interface in the Windows Admin Center if you wanted to. And then if we switch over to the view of virtual machines, we should see my BenB PSVHD virtual machine running there. I've got 4 gigs of memory just like we described. So if I click on that, I've got some specs about the virtual machine itself, and I can click connect here, and that's going to give me that virtual remote console of the Ubuntu server virtual machine that's running my help desk server. So now we've reached the point where you've got a physical piece of hardware, you've got Hyper-V Server 2019 installed on it as your host, you've got an Ubuntu server virtual machine called BenB VHDPS installed, and then we're accessing the console of that Ubuntu server now. So I'm going to authenticate using just the same Windows Hyper-V server host credentials. So this is not specific to the help desk server, this is specific to the host, the Hyper-V host. And you can see here I've got all the information that we needed to review the current configuration and state of that Ubuntu server and to launch and run the help desk server application there. So one of the first things you're going to do, and I've already kind of done it all here, you can see I've done IP space ADDR. That's going to list the network interfaces on my virtual machine. You can see number 2 there is Ethernet 0. And in this view, it's already got an IP address of 192.168.1.14. But if that was not the case, if you don't have an IP address, you may need to go run this command that follows there, sudo netplan apply, and that will try to refresh the IP address. If that doesn't work, you can also, let me click in here, you can also run sudo nano, which is a text editor, and edit this 50-cloud-init YAML file. If we do that, you'll see just briefly, this is the layout, very short and simple. The only thing you might need to edit here is the network interface. So once you've got the network interface matching, which is what we just saw, Ethernet 0, you can do Control O to save, and then Control X to exit that text editor view. And then if I do clear, you can see back to the prompt here. If I do IP address again, you can see I've got an IP address, but if I didn't, I would run this command to refresh the IP address and then check it again. Looks good. So now I've got my virtual machine up and running. It's connected to my local network. So now I just want to start, I want to launch the help desk server application. This is the same command that you use regardless of how you have it set up and installed. You use sudo tron kernel configure. That's going to launch the application. I've already done that, so we don't have to do that step. It takes a few minutes. Once you've gone through that step, again, to kind of review, we've got physical hardware, Hyper-V Server 2019 installed as a host for virtual machines. I've got my Ubuntu server installed on top of Hyper-V using that VHD file, which has the help desk server pre-installed into it. And then I run through a couple of quick commands here to make sure that my network interface looks good on that virtual machine. And then if so, I run sudo tron kernel configure, and now my help desk server application launches. So those are the setup steps from all the way from empty hardware to running the help desk server on top of Hyper-V Server 2019. So let's go take a quick look, kind of proof of concept here. So I've launched the application. If I click over to my browser session, you see I'm using that same IP address that we just saw there. And if I click over to one of these other pages here, you can see I'm able to interact with the help desk server normally. So I could go through my normal setup process and then start working tickets. So hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully it gives you a quick view of kind of all the steps necessary to have something that's relatively simple to administer and set up and get your help desk server installation off the ground using Microsoft technology and using our Ubuntu server-based help desk server product with as little Linux administration tasks as necessary just to get that network configuration set up. So if you have any questions or if you have any trouble getting things set up or you have feedback for us or those sorts of things, please do let us know. Please contact us. You can always reach our support team at support@spiceworks.com with any questions, problems, feedback, debugging help, troubleshooting, any of those sorts of things. We'd love to talk to you and help you and hear more about how you like to use the help desk server, what you want to run it on, and those sorts of things. Thanks so much.